So that one's going. So let's switch back into vignettes of young life with the family, switching over to Mamie. Just things you remember about being at home, things she used to cook, funny things she used to say or do, things you guys used to make fun of her for, whatever comes to mind.
Um,
And if I do something like this, it means the battery's about to die.
okay.
I don't want to speak over you in case you're in the middle of saying something.
So Mamie was the name my mother kind of acquired somewhere along the way. I guess maybe when the first grandchildren arrived, she was not Mamie until then. Always Mary. And she was much beloved among all of us. One of the memories I have is that when I was 16, I set out with two other high school buddies to hike the John Muir Trail in California. And at the time, the gear available for backpackers was very limited. To find a good backpack for the purpose was very hard. Mom helped me kind of find the materials, a frame, stitch together and make a frame, get totally outfitted for that trip. It was like she was sort of in on the fun of the project, helping me put that together. She had a great sense of humor. She, whatever temper she had, and I think she had one, at a certain level of heat, was generally kept totally in line. She was a huge favorite among the law students at both Stanford and Chicago. I particularly remember at Chicago, where I was old enough to be around the parties and occasionally do some bartending, that Mom was just a favorite of theirs, always encouraging and helping. And she had her two buddies on the block there, Kate Levy and Gene Meltzer. Levy and Meltzer were two professors at the university. I mentioned Levy, he was the dean before Dad. Meltzer was a very smart, distinguished professor at the law school, and in fact, our families lived next to each other, and most every morning when the weather was bad, Levy or Meltzer or Dad would drive the Neal boys and the Meltzer and Levy kids down the street to the lab school, which was about a mile away and a pretty crisp walk on a 10-degree day. So Mom would hang out with Kate and Jean. The houses were adjacent, back doors. Want an egg, go over, borrow an egg. They had a nice relationship. Mom had the same relationship before when we lived in Palo Alto. The dean of the, it was up on the hill behind Palo Alto actually, in the Stanford Hills, and the dean of the law school's house was kitty corner to ours, and there was kind of a hole in the fence so you could walk up through there. And the dean's wife was Sheila Spake, a wonderful Scottish lady, and Mom was always popping back and forth through that hole to see Sheila, get something from her, and get something for her.
What were the staples of the Mary Neal kitchen in terms of things you remember eating as a kid?
I can remember some of this, and in fact, I should add to the stack of supplemental materials what she fashioned the Jewish Mother's Cookbook, which she and Kate Meltzer and Jean Levy assembled. It was in handwritten form for a long time, then at some point years ago I transcribed it into typed form. It's around somewhere, and it had what I think you modern day chefs would regard as pretty simplistic recipes. There was cream tuna,
Beef stroganoff.
beef stroganoff, simple recipe, and then a whole bunch of simple recipes for things like how to make a casserole of rice, how to do a roast, how to do a hollandaise, and her hollandaise recipe stands the test through today. But it was all designed to be stuff that kids at college who didn't have much cooking skill could do. And I think it was pretty typical. I'm trying to remember dinner in our the back kitchen in our big old house on Woodlawn Avenue. It was very often creamed tuna, or she would lay chicken breasts on a bed of rice, bake that in a casserole. Now, I think her cooking skills were better than that overall, but that was kind of the working days cooking. It was just fine.
What was the atmosphere like at the dinner table when the four of you were old enough to?
I think it was pretty good. I don't have a strong recollection of it, but we always did sit down to dinner. Mom would make a big salad with a vinegar and oil dressing. Always a good mix. It was a very tasty dressing. And I was always, before dinner, trying to sneak by and pinch a piece. And Dad was always whacking my hand. No, wait till dinner. His other dinner time trick was that I would rock my chair. Maybe the other guys rocked their chair. We had these hickory upholstered chairs with four rather thin legs and a back, and maybe some prospect that rocking on them would do harm to him. I don't know, but we're always rocking back on the chair. That was a no-no.
What about competition between the brothers? At what age was that? Did that start happening, and what did it look like?
I don't remember that being a big deal. You know, I can have the most distant recollection of a fist fight or two with Steve or Tim, but very rare. One or two maybe, and I can't remember what the occasion was.
Is it true that Tim once chased Steve around the house with a butcher knife?
That is a takeoff on a story about Nancy Packer, who was a Birmingham, Alabama gal with red hair and a hot temper who chased her brother around the block with a butcher knife. I don't think Tim chased Steve around the block with a butcher knife or the house, but I do recall one event. Can't remember what touched him off, but we had a 3-story house. Remember Tim flying up the stairs in a rage and whanging that door shut so hard that the whole house shook. And that's what I recall on that theme.
Did Phil become softer as each boy came along? Was he less of a disciplinarian with Steve and then Tim and then Andy? Or
Yeah, I think so. I think it happens with most parents. And like I say, he was never put to the necessity of being a real strict disciplinarian, because he had an imposing moral authority over all of us. Now, he was also a pretty gutsy man, which I saw displayed one night. I came walking home down Woodlawn Avenue. It was probably a cold, gray evening, and 2 houses down from us was the house of Elijah Muhammad, the prophet of black Muslims. And there were some kids out front who kind of pushed us around as we went by. My dad, in his suit and his tie, marched us back out there and just dressed the shit out of these guys. And without the slightest hint of fear. I guess it was sort of his adult status or something, but he wasn't about to let that go unremarked on.
You had some other famous neighbors in that neighborhood.
We did. Down the street on the, well, first of all, across the street lived the son and wife of Joe Louis, the boxing great, world champion heavyweight boxer at some point. Joey was a little guy, very friendly. I remember fooling around with him. One thing I remember doing with him is taking apples, coring them out, stuffing a firecracker in the center, lighting the firecracker, and throwing it out over some neighbor's house.
And what would Phil have done if he had caught you doing it?
I don't have a clue. Don't have a clue.
Alright, one thing that'll make this part a little bit more helpful, and this is just pure function of like a production function. If
Yeah.
I ask you a question,
Yeah.
repeat the question in your answers. If I say, like, for example, was there any competition between you and Steve, use that in your answer so that I can cut it without my voice. So I
Okay.
can just have you saying, there wasn't much competition between Steve and I, and then it's like a full package rather than relying, because my voice is going to sound weird
Okay.
coming from behind. It still might be usable, but that's just something that makes
Okay.
it so that each little snippet fits together.
Okay.
Alright, so what about Christmas time? What did Christmas time used to look like?
What did Christmas time used to look like? We liked Christmas a lot. It was warmly and eagerly celebrated in the house. We decorated up. We had trees. We had lights on the tree. We had lots of ornaments. We eagerly awaited the arrival of our presents, and I think just generally very much enjoyed the season.
Did you ever travel anywhere to visit family Christmas?
I'm trying to remember. Seems to me like we might have driven down to Birmingham to visit the southern relatives for our Christmas once. We might have visited Uncle William. But I don't have any clear memories of that.
Alright, how about this? Finish this sentence. The most trouble I was ever in with my parents was when? Or the most afraid I was of seeing my parents was when for example, my example was the time that you guys went for a week and I went to the Dodger game and I tried to squeeze the car, the big Suburban,
Yeah.
into this tiny, there are 50 spaces past the next car, and I just decided to do this big turn and just fuck the side of the car, and I remember just dreading you guys coming back and seeing that and just being shit scared. So what would you say was the most?
Well, maybe mine is a similar incident where I had a newly acquired driver's license. I was down in a parking lot at 53rd Street in Woodlawn buying something at the drugstore or something. This car was a Plymouth Suburban, which was a brown square job with these bumpers about the size of a basketball. And I managed to back out of there right into the door of some guy's car, leaving a hole big enough, actually a dent, almost big enough to shove a basketball into. So I was pretty terrified that the old man would be really pissed off, and he instead was totally understanding, sort of seeming to know that this wasn't the time to jump all over my ass. Other than that, I was such a goody two-shoes as the number one kid, and sufficiently in awe, I guess. Steve was much more liberal about his shenanigans, and he didn't seem to get in much trouble for it.
Do you remember any specific shenanigans?
Well, and specifically, I remember that when the parents were out of town for some weekend, he had a girl in overnight. I won't say her name. And I'm sure had some booze in there, so there were two offenses. Not sure which would have been viewed as the more serious. But that's one I remember. No, I don't think any of us ever got in trouble with the law. we did have some, and we did have some fairly wild adventures as kids. One of them was driving from Chicago to the West Coast with two contemporaries from high school who lived around the corner and had one of these VW microbuses, you know, the orange, and which they were given to transport us out to the coast where we were going to do Sierra Club trips. And we got all the way out to west of Salt Lake City in the Great Salt Flats out there, and threw a rod and the thing just broke down. It was hotter than hell. And so I think Steve and I each bailed out and hitchhiked back to somewhere, maybe back to the airport. Steve, I know, hitchhiked back to the airport in Salt Lake. Not sure what I did. But I did a fair amount of long distance hitchhiking in the West, which I'm not sure people do anymore. You know, from central Idaho down to the east side of the Sierra in California, and in the east too, which was always kind of an adventure. Probably safer back then. I don't know.
What was the first summer that you left home to do rangering or to be gone from the nest? And repeat that again. So the first summer I was gone.
Well, the first summer I didn't stay at home would have been, let's see, 60, at least as early as 68. Probably earlier than that, because 63 was the summer that that I met Arnon on a Sierra Club trip, and it was the same summer that Peter Hildebrand and Danny Teitelbaum and I walked into the Sierra Club work trip, worked there for 10 days, and then turned north and walked up to the north terminus of the John Muir Trail. We'd taken enough food in, and that trip was an adventure because it was early. There was snow over huge portions of the trail. We had to pick our way over passes. We had no GPS. We had a set of maps, and we eventually learned to read them. We didn't get too badly lost. And we were carrying these huge heavy packs with a full-size grill, if you can believe it, eating Spam and pancakes and but
What initially piqued your interest in backpacking? Because backpacking has been a huge part of your life. How did that get started? When did the interest develop?
I'm going to say,
repeat that again. So the interest in backpacking.
my interest in backpacking and the outdoors, I think indirectly at least, I owed a dad. He had at Stanford Law School a student whose name was Philip Berry, who died recently, who graduated from Stanford Law School, one of Dad's students, and went on for some substantial period to be the director or head of the Sierra Club. And I think it was probably the summer of '61, Dad arranged to have us go, me and a school contemporary of mine, on a trip that Phil Berry was leading up in the Three Sisters Wilderness in Oregon. It was not a backpack trip, but it was a horseback trip where the horses carried most of the gear, and so that I was hooked after that. The next summer, I think we did a Sierra Club backpack trip. That was '62, and then '63 was the summer that we did the Muir Trail trip. And then pretty much after that, every summer I was.
Tell a little bit about what you think it was that hooked you, starting with what hooked me about it. Can you remember those moments?
Well, I think what hooked me about it was that I was just enchanted with the scenery, the smells, the cold stream water on the face, the sense of being up on top of mountains and passes I loved, and the exercise. I was throughout all this a track team member, so I was running half miles and half miles, and so that kind of fit in with miles and half miles, so that kind of fit in with the activity. And that's probably the nub of it.
Wait, one sec. Phone's gonna pick up. Let's pause for 2 seconds. I need to piss. And then we can, this will be good, we can go through some of your stories.